When the cabin lights wink and the alarm tone that should never sound in a routine test flight slices through the hush, a single thought slides into Su Rong's mind with the same cold clarity she keeps for equations and emergency checklists. This is the moment truth shows its face. She is standing in the doorway of the jump seat, palms steady against the molded plastic, watching a crew she trained move like a single organism around a plane that had, until an hour ago, been a stage for her humiliation. Outside the small oval windows, the weather is placid. The threat is inside the machine. On a screen mounted near the flight attendant station, words flicker in green and amber. Autopilot discrepancy, altitude hold erratic. Someone curses, soft and sharp, and the captain's voice comes over the intercom, clipped with professional panic. Can you patch into the system? Can you see what's wrong? She can see it. She is Miss Romans, and she has always been able to see what others refuse to see. Where code frays under pressure, how a human decision can be reduced to a line of logic, where causality hides in the small offsets and timestamps of logs. But in the public imagination, she is only Mrs. Liu, the name that carried pomp and pity in equal measure. Now, viral hate whispering through group chats and tabloid headlines since the divorce papers went viral. Those papers were supposed to be the final strip of paper that gave the Liu family back its control, their inheritance clause clean as a legal guillotine. Instead, those same headlines have turned her into an object, spectacle, rumor, and the woman people love to condemn. She slides into the jump seat with the composure of someone who has been observed and misread more often than she would like. The passenger cabin's murmur shifts. A child starts to cry, and the sound slices the cabin into a fine, aching cinnamon thread. An elderly man clutches his wife's hand and looks toward the front as if pleading for a miracle. The captain looks back at her, and, for the first time since the headlines, he doesn't look at her as someone scandalous. He looks at her as someone he needs. Su Rong, he says, more statement than introduction. Can you work with me? She nods. Her fingers touch the tablet mounted in front of her. She knows the system's heartbeat, the way data flows, and how to coax it. In a world that has tried to buy and sell her, one day a marriage certificate, the next day a contract for silence, she had kept her own ledger. Under names stacked like false walls, beneath the polite signature of Su Rong, she had a code name and a resume that did not fit the cheap narratives fed to the public. Miss Romans, safety engineer, architect of a failsafe, she hashed and hid inside a project she never let them fully read. Her identity has the kind of currency no one could gossip away, because its value is measured in lives, not inheritance clauses. Behind the seat, she sees the ring finger, empty now, of the woman who had once been presented at a Liu family banquet. The ring is a motif, the small circle that means ownership to some and promise to others. Someone on the crew reaches for the medkit. A stewardess whispers, "If it's a software thing, she's the one." And then there is the brief hush that means everyone is waiting for a miracle. 3 years earlier, in a dining room lit by soft lamps and the unblinking eyes of portraits, Su Rong had sat across from Grandpa Liu and his son, the man who would become Captain Liu Zhang. It was a meeting that began as a contract rather than a conversation. She had been young and pragmatic and tired of hiding, of the way her name was preceded by a cautionary tone in the corridors of the airline. The Liu family needed a marriage that would calm rumor and bind inheritance to lineage. She needed protection against the daily grind of an industry that made women invisible. A clause here, a signature there, a promise of care for the child she did not yet know she carried. The bargain was ugly in parts, necessary in others. They sealed it with polite wine, the patriarch's eyes like an overseer's seal. Su Rong accepted the terms because she thought survival required bargaining, because she believed, in the naive way of good people, that contract and heart could be separated. People will call her betrayed or opportunistic. They will not see how carefully she measured the weight of that ring in her palm, how she cataloged the days in which she tolerated small indignities to protect the one life inside her that needed safety. The child, whose heartbeat she discovered in the dark between shifts, became the axis of her decisions. In the quiet of her apartment, she mapped out a future in tattooing notebooks and late-night code scribbles. She loved the child instinctively and fiercely. She promised herself it would never be a pawn. The divorce papers leaked because Liu family politics are a thing that thrives on theater. Grandpa Liu, whose authority over Longcheng Airlines was a pillar of both legacy and greed, had made his will conditional on lineage and legacy. The clause that tied a child to inheritance, the clause that named a widow's claim as a path to corporate succession, turned a private marriage into a public fight. When the divorce became a bargaining chip, it was meant to intimidate Su Rong into silence, strip her of legal leverage, strip her name of legal consequence, then fold the scandal into the family's carefully curated narrative. The social engines did what they always do when there is drama among the wealthy. They began to churn. Photos surfaced, a staged series of images taken in a hotel bar, intentionally ambiguous and captioned with innuendo. A video clip landed in marketing inboxes and in the dark corners of gossip accounts. Su Rong, smiling, a man's hand on her wrist, but without the timestamp anyone could trust. People started to talk. Commenters speculated with the cruelty of authoritarian scalpel. Her colleagues at the airline faced a meme culture that made jokes out of pain. Lin Zhenzhen, who had once worked under the guise of ally, allowed her rivalry to bloom into open censure. She was a safety supervisor with a smile that could steal into a public accusation. Lin's eyes always had a question in them. Did Su Rong deserve anything beyond what she had been assigned? Lin's motives were complex, professional jealousy braided with something like familial resentment. Rumors seeded by Lin proved fertile. By the time Su Rong announced she was pregnant, careful, deliberate, her voice steady as she told the human resources head in a private office, the rumor mill had already declared her either an opportunist or a victim. The truth, as always, lodged between both. The announcement was a quiet act of defiance. It put a public timestamp on the bargaining chip Grandpa Liu had been trying to remove from play. It turned her from a rumor into a person with a legal claim. It pivoted the boardroom calculus. But it also painted a target on her back. When inheritance becomes currency, everyone learns to think in terms of scarcity. The first public blow came in the form of a lunch table leak, an edited transcript of a private message where Lu Zhang, proud, unable to be half kind, was shown to have pressured her into silence, suggesting, in words that could be read as threatening, that they both knew how to make a marriage look seamless. The caption called her Mrs. Liu, as if that alone could encapsulate a woman's entirety. The Liu family's allies, anxious about their stake, quietly pitched offers to anyone who would silence her: money, relocation, cushioned exits. There were emails, there were veiled threats. A rival airline offered an obscene sum to simply remove her from the public eye, to buy the rights to a silence she had not yet consented to sell. At the center of it all, Lu Zhang sits with his hands folded too tightly around a glass and a decision that tastes like iron. He is the man whose public image requires him to be decisive. He is not a villain made of cartoon malice. He is complex, wounded by pride, sincere in ways that surprise people who see him only in headlines. He had married her under pressure, and part of him had believed in the marriage's awkward sincerity. He had watched his father tilt at the wind of corporate rumor, and he had been taught the language of power as literal ammunition. A letter could be a weapon, a signature, a grenade. Lu Zhang's internal world is made of habits, a sharpened focus on the company, a deep discomfort with indecision. When the divorce leaked, his instinct was to armor himself. His heart, flawed and real, went the other way in private moments where he had lingered by Su Rong's apartment doorway and found himself with a soft ache he could not name. The smear campaign ramps up. Lin Zhenzhen steps forward as an unofficial accuser, pointing to protocol violations she claims were committed by Su Rong, minor things blown up in committee memos, exaggerated into proof of incompetence. The internet loves evidence that fits a pre-existing narrative, and so the narrative births its own evidence. Someone fabricates a CCTV still that seems to show Su Rong entering a private corridor where she could not have been. An editor at a popular gossip channel peddles a video clip of a party that never occurred. The Lu family, unsure which side's safety outweighs scandal, begins to see Su Rong as an inconvenience to their succession plan. But while the world is busy making its own story, Su Rong is quietly assembling instruments of truth. She keeps a journal of timestamps. She keeps code snippets annotated with impenetrable shorthand. She speaks in cold precision when she has to, and moves with warm calculation when she chooses. When the offers to buy her silence arrive, money enough to change the contours of any life, she refuses. Not because she is naive or because she seeks martyrdom, because she knows that her worth, the thing that really secures her child's future, is not in a bank account paid to mute a conscience. She would rather prove her system than be paid to disappear. The reveal that Su Rong is not just a flight attendant, but Miss Romans, an engineer whose work has quietly patched the edges of aviation safety across borders, comes not with trumpets, but with facts. She does not appear on a red carpet to proclaim herself. She walks into a boardroom, lifts her sleeve so a senior engineer can see her annotated scribbles, and then watches the room rearrange itself around new reality. It is a revealing precise as any surgical cut, a snippet of code on a secure server, a series of simulation results, and then a calm presentation that turns the faces in the room from suspicion to unsettled respect. It happens in front of the board of an airline that had once offered her silence. Her voice is quiet, the language technical but accessible. She explains the architecture of her safety net, redundant sensors, traceable handshakes, a failsafe that delays catastrophic responses long enough for human intervention. She explains, in the simplest terms, how a small hidden tag in a log can point back not just to an attack vector, but to the originator's intent. She offers a controlled demo, not to showcase genius, but to provide a plausibility that refutes rumor. The engineers in the room lean in. Their interest is clinical. Even Lin Zhenzhen, who has been a thorn in her side, cannot help the half grin that appears when a simulation confirms Su Rong's math. Word leaks in the way that real facts do, slowly, with reluctance and grudging admiration. People who had reduced her to a scandal now have to reconcile the fact that the person they mocked might be the person tasked with keeping them safe. This reversal is crucial. The public narrative, once framed around what she had lacked, is now being forced to acknowledge what she contains. But the public moves slowly, and rumor moves faster. The smear continues, even as professional acknowledgement grows. The internet learns new lies faster than it can learn to respect truth. Out of the ashes of humiliation, offers begin to arrive with a different tenor. Oh Shi-yuan watches all of it with a steadiness that unnerves the tabloid cameras. He is a billionaire, yes, but his presence is shaped by something more delicate than money. He is candid without show, an executive at Longcheng's rival operations, publicly unassuming, privately purposeful. He sees Su Rong the way a careful botanist sees a plant that needs tending, not as an asset, not as an object of pity, but as someone whose boundaries need to be respected. He arranges a lunch, carefully casual, in a small restaurant that serves exactly the food Su Rong used to crave late after shifts: braised eggplant with garlic, rice that has been pressed with sesame. He speaks in a voice that knows when to leave space and when to offer support. He listens to the outlines of her life, not the gossip. He admires the way she answers questions without warbling into self-justification. "You don't have to say yes to anyone who wants to buy you," he tells her once. His steadiness feels like an offering of something she had not expected could be real. A man who is not fascinated by the spectacle, but by the person. His offers are honest. He offers not silence as a commodity, but resources as tools: legal counsel, a secure research grant, the possibility to scale her system through his company's channels. He does not propose marriage in the first meetings. He offers partnership, then friendship, then a possibility that gives her agency rather than takes it away. Where Lu Zhang's family offered transactions dressed as care, where Grandpa Lu's clauses treated people as coordinates on a map of corporate control, Oh Shi-yuan offers constellations, a way to situate herself without being subsumed. In private, her interactions with Oh Shi-yuan plant small seeds of another kind of life. He is patient. He asks questions like someone cataloging an object of rare origin. What did she fear at night? How did she teach herself error margin calculations on a secondhand laptop? What did the taste of victory smell like to her when she solved a particularly stubborn logic drift in a simulator? He is never condescending. He makes notes with a pen, the way someone who knows money can sometimes be unburdened by it. To the watchers outside, he is simply another sponsor. To Su Rong, he is something else: a man who presumes her agency rather than tries to purchase it. Meanwhile, the Lu family tightens their grip. Grandpa Lu, who has always regarded the company as a legal and cultural monument, one that should never be sullied by messy human constraints, begins to speak in a language of recalculation. He convenes family dinners that feel more like interrogations, where menus are second to legal clauses and where photos of past heirs line the walls like a threat. When Lu Zhang arrives, the easy armor of his public composure is thinner. There is strain in his jaw when he looks at Su Rong. He still loves the shape of what could have been, even as his public duty compels him to close ranks with a family that will never fully forgive a scandal attached to their name. There are moments, rare and private, where Lu Zhang is raw with a regret he does not know how to apologize for. He sits in his car outside the hospital one night and watches Su Rong walk in with a file tucked against her chest. He wants to go to her, to tell her that he has not always wanted to be the kind of man his family demands, but pride coils his tongue. He understands that the divorce papers were not only business, they were an attempt to make pain bearable through precision. He has not been a kind husband. He has been, for much of their marriage, a man who relied on privilege to speak and expected compliance. Now, in the slow quarantine of guilt, he begins to see the consequences of his choices in the eyes of people who cannot be purchased. Lin Zhenzhen watches it all with a different calculation. She is not immune to compassion, but she has been trained by a system that rewards survival. Her rivalry with Su Rong is complicated by professional habit and an older memory. Her family once lost a seat at a table because of a scandal, and she has never forgiven the world for that. To see a woman take advantage of the same system now unsettles her. To see that woman become competent threatens Lin's own claim to professional respect. She sharpens her public voice, preparing memos and pointed questions. Her instinct is to protect an industry that she fears otherwise will be corrupted by emotional entanglements. Her actions are not purely malicious. They come from a place of fear that the industry cannot afford crease. The test flight is Su Rong's answer. She refuses the offers and the hush money because she wants to prove something fundamental. that competence must win in the open. She drafts a plan to implement her new safety framework in a controlled demonstration. No marketing fanfare, only a clear test flight with an agreed protocol, an independent auditor, and a live feed for a select group of aviation experts. When her colleagues ask why she resists the simpler path of being quietly relocated, she answers, because someone needs to know it works when it matters. She is not making a speech, she is making a promise. The air is brisk the morning of the test flight. Cameras and engineers gather in a hush of professional curiosity. Smaller hands clutch phones designed to capture the wrong thing at the wrong moment. The deck of the plane is scrubbed with the clinical attention of a surgical team. The test flight is Su Rong's answer. She refuses the offers and the hush money because she wants to prove something fundamental, that competence must win in the open. She drafts a plan to implement her new safety framework in a controlled demonstration. No marketing fanfare, only a clear test flight with an agreed protocol, an independent auditor, and a live feed for a select group of aviation experts. When her colleagues ask why she resists the simpler path of being quietly relocated, she answers, because someone needs to know it works when it matters. She is not making a speech, she is making a promise. The air is brisk the morning of the test flight. Cameras and engineers gather in a hush of professional curiosity. Smaller hands clutch phones designed to capture the wrong thing at the wrong moment. The deck of the plane is scrubbed with the clinical attention of a surgical team. They have invited neutral auditors, people whose names will not be easily swayed by rumor. There is a wrinkle of tension when Lin Zhenzhen steps onto the tarmac, her expression reserved, as if she were a judge and not a rival. Grandpa Liu watches from a distance, his posture a steady grandiosity tempered by suspicion. The Liu family's legal counsel is there, and the air tastes faintly of lemons and machine oil. Su Rong stands at the threshold of the plane, a boarding pass tucked in her hand. Her belly is small and still carefully shielded by layers. She moves as a woman who has learned to keep her life private against a world that compels exhibition. She runs last checks in her head: sensor handshake, logger integrity, fallback priority. She has embedded a trace into the system, an innocuous tag that will remain dormant until an unauthorized instruction attempts to overwrite the safety handshake. If someone tries to sabotage the sequence, the trace will mark the packet's path, exposing its route like a breadcrumb trail of culpability. She designed it not to be a trap for curious colleagues, but as evidence against those who would weaponize code. She knows this is an audacious move. If it works, it rewrites more than a few headlines. If it fails, the failure will be public. In the control room, an engineer says something about, "We've got a trace ID," and a line of characters shivers across the screen. It is small and clinical. Trace ID 7A3B 9C1E. Intrusion 01314 UTC. The kind of line that, if followed, can become a rope to pull down a conspiracy. The auditors whisper. Someone reaches for coffee and forgets to sip it. Lu Zheng, watching from the cordoned-off VIP gallery, feels a tightening like a fist in his chest. He does not yet know that this test will become a pivot in his life, that his next choices will be measured not only in corporate terms, but in the way he asks for forgiveness. The takeoff is unremarkable at first. The plane rises with the ordinary poetry of machines and people moving toward a goal. Cameras click. Social accounts begin to needle the feed. Su Rong watches the instruments, peaceful in a way that people do not assign to women in the middle of scandal. She is attuned to the rhythm of sensors and heartbeat, and everything reads as nominal. Then a notification, an alert in the monitoring suite, a flicker in the telemetry that is fleeting enough to be missed, but not by those who listen. A subtle offset in the autopilot handshake, a millisecond misalignment, a packet that refused to echo back. Someone in the back room mutters, "Did you see that? Could be noise." Noise is always possible. Too many things conspire to create false positives. But Su Rong is not one to dismiss a whisper. She leans forward, watches the log cascade across the screen like snow. A tracer lights up, the tag she set pulsing like a lighthouse in the gloom. At the same time, a private feed that only a handful can access lights up in a different room. In a downtown office with close-cropped windows, someone watches the same trace and smiles in a way that suggests malice rather than relief. There is a code name on a document they keep, Operation Cutting Line. They do not yet know they have just walked into a trace that will someday be used to string them to a crime. They are smug, confident in their ability to manipulate narrative. They do not suspect that Su Rong has been thinking 2 moves ahead for months. The alarm that rises within the plane is not the kind of sound engineered to panic passengers. It is part of the protocol, but when it begins to echo in a cabin where people's lives are in the balance, it breaks the rhythm of normalcy. Crew members move with practiced calm. A mother pulls her scarf tighter around her baby. The captain's voice returns to the intercom. "We have a control anomaly. We are initiating manual procedures. Please remain seated and trust the crew." Trust, in that moment, is a rare currency. As the plane breathes, Su Rong's mind catalogs the sequence. The trace she planted had fired on an authorization loop, pinging in the kind of way that marked a path through the company's architecture. It should have been a clean demonstration. Instead, the misalignment is persistent enough to demand manual intervention. She works with the engineers in real time, her fingers moving over a screen, her voice under her collarbone issuing commands and confirmations the way a conductor keeps a choir intact. Outside the windows, clouds roll like slow waves. Inside, a life depends not just on machines, but on the ability of a few people to read a pattern under pressure. When the plane stabilizes, after a tense few minutes that feel like hours in compressed heartbeat, applause should be impossible, but there is a small intake of breath that is almost like prayer. The auditors exchange looks. Someone who had been planning to write a scathing piece about her competence finds their words stuck under the weight of what they just witnessed. Later, the evidence will chain together. Logs with timestamps, IP ranges that loop suspiciously through anonymizers, a trace ID that maps to a server controlled by a shell company with ties to investors who had motives in destabilizing Longcheng. The path will be methodical. System logs, trace back to a relay, surveillance footage that shows a hand on a keyboard, witness statements from an intern coerced into copying files. But in that moment, aboard the plane, only the immediate present matters. Su Rong squeezing a minute of calm into the machinery of panic, and the fragile hope that the truth, once it becomes visible, will carry weight. After the plane lands, the reporting storm begins. Some outlets headline her heroism, others pivot, clinging to the scandalous margin like a life buoy. Social streams erupt with conflicting narratives. Lin Zhenzhen posts a terse statement, questioning protocol and reminding the public that rules matter. Grandpa Liu issues a neutral communique about the company's commitment to safety, careful as a surgeon's incision to avoid appearing culpable. Lu Zheng watches the feeds with a face stripped of mask, his emotions pressed raw against his skin. He wants to say something loud and brash, something that will fix the past by conquering the future. He is tempted to make a public gesture, a spectacle to reclaim control, to ask for reconciliation in a way that reasserts his authority but also admits his wrongs. Pride whispers to him the language he knows, the one that has always solved problems with power. The other voice, soft, private, suggests apology as a form of repair, offered not as a performance but as a surrender. Still, in the swirl of immediate consequences, another darker motion pulls taut. Someone in the wings watches the trace as proof of where to strike next. Sabotage becomes a plausible explanation only if you have the stomach to create it. Jealousy and fear create messy motives. The people who feel threatened by Su Rong's competence, those who assumed she would take the quiet money, begin to look at the test flight as a problem they must solve by other means. That night, a small group gathers in a dimly lit office to talk about damage limitation. There are legal memos and whispered strategies. There is a suggestion, cold as winter, that if they cannot neuter her with cash, perhaps they could use the public's appetite for sensationalism to drown out the facts. Someone proposes planting more evidence. Another recommends a smear that will make the public forget the technicalities and focus instead on the spectacle of scandal. They talk like people who believe in their own immunity. Su Rong goes home to a narrow apartment that holds the artifacts of a life lived in 2 registers: a battered laptop, a framed certificate, a small wooden kitchen table that saw too many sleepless nights. She makes tea and sits with her hand on her belly. The quiet is a small rebellion. She reads the message Oh Shiwan left on her phone, gentle, practical, asking if she is okay and if she wants him to send a car. She declines because she is not someone who needs rescuing. She is someone who wants to hold the line. But she is grateful because there is a kind of solace in being seen without spectacle. Among the aftermath is a quiet legal maneuver. Someone files an injunction to delay any immediate questions about the inheritance clause. Grandpa Lu's lawyers speak in measured tones about timing and optics. They worry less about safety than about dynasty. The company's board calls an emergency meeting where voices rise and fall like tides. Su Rong is invited to give a formal statement about the test flight. She is no longer a curiosity, she is an evidence-bearing witness in a court of public opinion. At midnight, Lu Zhang sits alone with his reflection in a dark window. The idea forms in him like a dangerous bloom, a public gesture that might reframe everything. A proposal, an offer of marriage, not to win him a business trick, but offered as a way to publicly repair what he had once allowed to crumble. It would be grand, a spectacle to match the spectacle that had tried to consume her. He imagines standing in front of the press, offering his ring and his apology, and the promise of a united front. In his mind, it would buy back the narrative. He imagines the headlines, CEO asks to reclaim family, or Lu Zhang reconciles with ex-wife, and he dreams that in the act of asking, he could change the calculus of what they call love and duty. He practices elements of the speech with his hands, smoothing his tie, rehearsing phrases intended to sound contrite without sounding theatrical. There is, beneath the sheen of self-composure, a trembling thing, a hope that once he is magnanimous in public, they will forgive him in private. It is pride's last machination, to apologize, not to heal, but to control. The next morning begins with a flurry of reporters and a rumor that the CEO will make a statement. Su Rong knows nothing of Lu Zhang's private dramatics when she arrives at the boardroom, only the shape of the meeting on the schedule, her testimony, an offer from Longcheng to implement her system on a trial basis, and the presence of auditors who will finally, perhaps, be able to make sense of the trace she planted. Oh Shiwan waits in a corner of the hall, understated and composed, offering her a look that says neither pity nor purchase. He respects boundaries. He offers options. When the cameras are turned toward the VIP gallery and Grandpa Lu's lawyers, when the world leans in to watch whether a marriage ring will change a company's fate, no one yet knows that narrative is about to fragment. The twist, the thing that no headline can fully predict, will hinge on a proposal offered not as a solution, but as a test of whose future is being honored. Subscribe to follow Su Rong's story. The meeting begins with formalities. A projector throws up the telemetry from the test flight. The trace glows like evidence on a chalkboard. Engineers point to packets and timestamps. A legal counsel drones through caveats. Lin Zhenzhen asks a pointed question about protocol that is less about safety and more about establishing narrative dominance. Su Rong answers with precise clarity that leaves little room for the kind of sloppy accusations that had filled her past weeks. The board is split. Some see monetary upside, some see political danger. There are murmurs about external influence, investors who might prefer a palatable narrative to an inconvenient truth. The conversation is clinical until Lu Zhang rises. He is not yet the man on his knees that tabloids will later imagine. He is instead the CEO who knows how to command a room, who uses cadence as his instrument. He speaks about duty, reconciliation, and the family's desire to move forward. He offers, softly at first, and then with increasing conviction, the outline of a gesture so public the press will not be able to look away. "We will do what is right," he says, which in corporate parlance can mean anything and everything. He proposes an open-ended idea, an announcement that would realign the family's narrative in a way that protects the company and, in his mind, repairs the private wrongs he had allowed. The audience leans forward. Some nod in relief. Others frown at the possible optics. Su Rong listens, feeling both the old stirrings of something that once resembled safety and the distinct, unfamiliar sensation of being offered back into a life that once made demands she is no longer willing to meet without guarantees. She thinks of the way her child's heartbeat had quickened when she had sat through code corrections at ungodly hours. She remembers nights when Lu Zhang had been distant under the same roof. The proposal, if it is truly what it seems, will not be a simple choice between love and duty. It will be a test of whether she will allow her life to be framed by another's narrative again. In the gallery of cameras and files, Shu Yuan's face is an island of quiet measurement. He watches Lu Zhang with a calm that suggests he knows what is coming, but will not force his hand. He knows power, and he knows that sometimes power is exercised by restraint. For Su Rong, he is evidence that a man can offer partnership without strings. As Lu Zhang reaches the crescendo of his public empathy, Su Rong feels the world narrow to a simple geometry: a ring meant to seal, a career that needs vindication, and a child who will grow into a future shaped by her choice. The room hangs on her face for a beat that is, for her, a space where she can refuse to be romanticized into submission. It is not yet time to decide. The proposal is a pivot on the horizon, unmade and yet already altering the trajectory of how people will act. The test flight's trace has lit a fuse. In quiet rooms, people strategize. In darker corridors, someone moves with a purpose that looks dangerously like sabotage. The next move will not be a simple step toward reconciliation, nor a neat bow of vindication. It will be a crossing where choices have costs. Outside, cameras capture frames that will be threaded into 1,000 social feeds: the ring, the trace code, the small hand on a belly. Inside, Su Rong thinks of Shu Yuan's earlier words about partnership and of the ledger in her laptop where she keeps the real items that matter. She thinks of her child, of the life she wants to construct, a life not purchased but built. The meeting adjourns with no resolution. People disperse. Lin Zhenzhen walks away with a look that is carefully neutral. Grandpa Lu's staff catalog the event as they would a storm. Lu Zhang leaves with the weight of intent heavy in his stride. He has made an opening, public in tone and performative in intent, but whether it is a genuine apology or another attempt to reroute the narrative remains suspended like a held breath. That night, a single file is copied from a secure workstation. The security camera outside the server room records a shadow with gloved hands. The excerpt is small, easy to dismiss to anyone who wants to dismiss it. But the copy reveals a pattern. Someone is laying groundwork for a story they intend to sell as truth. The trace Su Rong planted will make it harder. The person who took the file does not know that their action will become a strand connecting to a chain of events that will change more than corporate fate. Su Rong sleeps fitfully, not because she fears for her life, but because she is haunted by the idea that systems built to protect can also be turned against the people who trust them. Her sleep is fitful also because change carries with it a peculiar adrenaline, the sense that a life is about to pivot because she refused to be sold. She has refused many things in the past months, and now a different refusal swells inside her. Refusal to be rewoven into someone else's narrative again. Dawn finds her at the test lab as engineers prepare forensic backups. She watches a log scroll and finds, with a professional's cold pleasure, that the trace behaved exactly as she expected. It contains a breadcrumb, a relay server, routed through a shell in a city far from Longcheng. It contains an address that, with enough digging, could be traced to a person who has both motive and means. She files the evidence not to triumph, but to protect, knowing full well that evidence is useless until someone has the courage to pair it with accountability. At a corner table in a quiet cafe, Wu Shiwan slides a cup of coffee toward her. He does not question her about the ring. He does not ask her to accept anything. He offers the coffee with a look that says, "I will be here when you are ready." The offer is small and vast. He does not do dramatics. He does not try to fix what has been broken with gestures. He shows up in the quieter ways that make promises stand. Across town, in a private residence ringed by old wealth and older feuds, Lu Xing rehearses words that might look like confession, but could be a brand of control. He plans a public moment, a proposal, not to win her back by force, but to assert that he wants to be seen as someone who cares. Whether that will persuade Su Rong to accept the old narrative, or whether it will be the moment she chooses a new path, hangs like a question mark over the city. The city, meanwhile, breathes with curiosity. Reporters build timelines, friends construct opinions, online forums spin threads into gossip. Su Rong, quiet, resilient, meticulous, continues to do what she always has: prepare for the things that matter, one careful step at a time. She files the logs, she shops for a tiny blanket soft enough for an infant, and she sharpens her resolve. The next action will not be discreet. It will be the interleaving of choices, a public gesture from a man unaccustomed to surrender, a corporate board that moves like tectonic plates, and a trace that maps a path from sabotage to someone's hand. Love, whether old or new, will be offered as solution, but the real decision will be about authority: who decides, who owns, and who keeps the right to name a life. On a flight deck in a controlled hangar, engineers replay a moment in slow motion. The trace still pulses on the screen. Someone says the word intent as if it were an accusation. The idea of ownership, of whether a marriage certificate can determine a child's legal place in a dynasty, sits at the center of every conversation like an open wound. Su Rong, who has spent years learning to listen to the whispers in code, knows only one thing with certainty: truth is messy and slow, and she is willing to wait and fight and prove until the world matches reality. At dawn, the city smelled of rain on hot concrete, a thin, hopeful perfume that made Su Rong pause before opening her apartment door. The forensic backups were complete. The trace behaved like a compass. She walked to the lab with the quiet of someone carrying a fragile truth. The backup tapes hummed as if they too held their breath. She and a small team, 2 trusted engineers, a neutral auditor, and O Shiwan's counsel, ran the traceback again, following the breadcrumb trail through relays and proxies until the path narrowed to a single nervy relay, a shell hosting company whose payments were routed through an investor with ties to a private consortium that had once bid, discreetly, for a piece of Longchang's regional routes. The list of names was not glamorous. It contained accountants, a PR firm, a private security consultancy, and, buried like a small coal in a coal seam, a contracted hacker who had been paid through an intermediary. "He's careful," one of the engineers said, rubbing his temple. "But incompetence and arrogance leave prints. They picked a relay that had been used before. With patience, you can match patterns." Patience was Su Rong's unusual weapon. She had learned to wait in code, a slow algorithm that eventually returned a result. She filed the data with the Aviation Authority and with a special investigative unit that handled cyber intrusion. She supplied the auditors with the full packet capture, the signed hash of her own deployment, the trace ID, and the time-stamped handshake that proved intent. She did not stage a reveal at a press conference. She let the paperwork inhabit bureaucratic spaces where the law could begin to do its job. She had long since learned that truth deployed correctly was the opposite of spectacle. What she did not expect was how quickly the other side would react. At noon, someone from the lab called, voice clipped with stress. "A workstation just disappeared from the secure room," he said. "CCTV shows the server room door was opened by a card, but the log says nobody authorized it. We're pulling footage now." Su Rong's stomach tightened. The footage showed a gloved figure slipping through the door at 12:42 a.m., a shadow that moved with the certainty of someone who had walked that corridor before. The gloved hands lifted a drive, slid it into a sleeve, and left. It was efficient and clinical, the sort of theft that suggested a professional had been hired. Whoever ordered it knew how to erase their handprints. Whoever backed them had resources. Whoever had opposed her had gone from rumor to sabotage to outright theft in a matter of days. They compiled the evidence. The stolen drive contained a partial copy of the backup she had made, a reconnaissance file, and a list of requested data. The timestamps were recent. The relay had been used to exfiltrate data earlier that month. The pattern fit: someone intent on substitution, on claiming a narrative advantage if they could drown her truth under manufactured chaos. By evening, anonymous threats arrived in a more explicit form. A video uploaded to a private server showed a blurred figure speaking in a voice modulator. "Drop the trace, sign the papers, and we all forget this, or the child's life becomes a footnote." The clip was primitive and cowardly. It carried the sting of true menace because it named what she loved most. Fear, when it seeks leverage, looks for the thing a person will not give up. The mention of her pregnancy proved they knew more than the public did. The message was illegal, vicious, and precisely the kind of cruelty that had been whispered in the background for months. Su Rong called Oh Shiyuan and told him to activate what he had promised: legal teams, security, an off-grid safe room if necessary. He arrived with understated supplies, security protocols, a vetted driver, a calm face. He did not hug or console at first. He shut the door to the room they prepared and said, "We keep you safe. We let the law do the rest." His steadiness felt like a small salvation. They laid plans that night. She would make another controlled disclosure to the authorities, give them every packet and log, and request expedited action. They would place decoys, the kind of decoy that looked authentic enough to distract, but all decoys would be monitored by her team so they could see who took the bait. She slept badly. Every muscle teemed to the knowledge that someone with nothing to lose might escalate. The escalation came 3 nights later. Su Rong left the lab at midnight. A friend was driving her to a safe location where the forensic team could work without risk of interruption. They had scheduled a short detour to pick up an essential document from her apartment. The driver turned a corner, and the headlights swept across a van that had not been there a second before. A second van descended from an alley. Men moved like practiced units, not amateurs. There was a shove, a struggle, and then the world contracted to the inside of a van and the smell of leather and antiseptic. A cloth was pressed to her mouth. Her world narrowed to a countdown. Breathe, count, find anchor points. She could feel a hand on the small of her back, fingers rough with impatience. Someone murmured, "Keep her quiet. Don't hurt the baby." They were either lazy or cruel in their own calculus. They said the baby's name aloud, as if invocation could be a pressure tool. They believed threats could thin resolve. They did not account for two things: Su Rong's stubbornness and Oh Shiyuan's quiet determination. The van drove with the indifferent speed of someone who believes the city will swallow a crime. They stopped in a warehouse that smelled of rust and old oil. The men moved her into a room lit by a single bare bulb. There was a chair, a plastic cup that smelled faintly of bleach, a camera mounted in a corner. The men took her phone and pulsed a message out into the dark. A single image, a hostage photo with the same crude demand: drop the case, sign the agreement, and stay silent, or else. The knot in her stomach was not only fear, it was a vivid, angry clarity. They believed they could exchange the shame and the scandal for control. They had underestimated what agency looks like within a woman who had spent her life turning the wrong kind of power into a tool for justice. She had not been an adherent to a martyr's script. She was a strategist who kept contingency tags in code and human contingencies in people who loved her. Within minutes, Oh Shiyuan was in motion. He had not waited for the police. He had activated resources, trusted field operatives, a private investigator who had once worked with him, and a team from a security firm that owed him a favor. They triangulated the van's last ping and followed leads through camera feeds and toll plate scanners. In the early hours, they found the warehouse and watched as two men paced near the door, cigarettes curled like question marks between their fingers. The team moved as silently as the men who had taken her had done. There was a scuffle, a shout, the metallic ring of a door being forced open, then the quiet feltness of relief, like a hand finally finding a pulse. Su Rong remembers the squeeze of Oh Shiyuan's hand as he guided her out of the warehouse, the way he did not ask questions at first, but only steered her toward safety. There was an incision of pain across her abdomen that made her breath hitch. She had not realized when the pounding in her belly had first turned into a demonstrable contraction. The men had not physically harmed her in a way she would later count as assault, but the jolt of the abduction, the terror, the stress, had done something inside that moved labor forward in a way no one could have predicted. They reached the hospital on a wet morning, a courier of exhausted relief. The emergency team moved quickly. The monitors blinked. The triage nurse said, "She's in active labor, and there's fetal distress." And the room gathered itself into a mechanized choreography. The baby's heart showed a pattern that demanded immediate action. Hands moved with the calm rehearsal of people who work against time. Anesthesia prepped, consent forms signed in haste, the surgeon's face set like a mask. Lu Zhang arrived 3 minutes after the doctors wheeled Su Rong into the operating suite. He had been notified when the abduction alert had gone out. He came running into the hospital foyer, tie undone, cheeks flushed, the kind of rawness in his eyes that no boardroom could ever replicate. The weight of what he had tried to conceal collapsed into the present. That misused power had become an instrument of harm. That his family's plans had put someone he had once married in danger. He had not known how to be brave before. Here, bravery looked like small, frantic prayers muttered against his shirt collar. When a nurse told him she had been brought in with fetal distress, his knees knocked like a man who had been emptied. Outside the OR, Wu Shiyuan stood with a face carefully composed. He had insisted on staying in the waiting room because Su Rong had asked him not to be theatrical. "Be practical," she had told him over a brief call when her voice had been a thin thread. "Hold the press at bay. Make sure my team keeps the trace sealed." so he sat, and in his hands he held a folder of legal petitions, his thumb absently smoothing the edge of a card Su Rong had once given him. It was intimate in a small way, the bookmark of a friendship that now felt like scaffolding against the storm. Lu Zhang found a chair and sank into it like a defeated man. He did not phone the board or Grandpa Lu. He only whispered to himself in that small, terrible way people do when they feel the rawness of possible loss. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." The surgery lasted an hour that stretched into the kind of eternity only punctuated by clipped doors and the dull beeping of monitors. The doctors emerged with a baby swaddled in hospital light and Su Rong pallid but stable. There was bleeding controlled with a transfusion and an incision repaired with calm competence. In the recovery room, Su Rong blinked and named the sound of her child's cry as if naming was an incantation against the chaos of the last few nights. The child was small and alert, already squinting at the light with the stubbornness of someone who had been through too much before his first breath. Lu Zhang went to the bassinet as if magnetized. He looked at the infant the way a man might look at a mirror that shows a different reflection. His features were there, but this tiny life was not a part of his plan to control. He had not been the protector he should have been. His apology to Su Rong later did not arrive as a grand speech, but a hand on the baby's blanket and a face wet with unshed grief.
He said, "I was wrong," and the words were flat with honesty in a way that public statements rarely are. The hospital became a locus where private decisions collided with public spectacle. Reporters camped at the gates. Social feeds offered hot takes. Had her rescue been staged? Was the abduction a publicity stunt? Could a CEO's family be so cold as to engineer violence to manipulate succession? The rumor mill, as always, turned a blade on itself, seeking to profit from the pain of others. In the fragile hours after the birth, the investigators had already pulled more data. The trace led, as the lab had suspected, to a relay used by a contracted hacker. The hacker, a man with a history of being hired to create narrative gaps and to vanish, had been traced to a cyber cafe run by a shell company. Surveillance footage that had at first looked grainy and unhelpful found clarity under forensic enhancement. A hand on a keyboard, a face turned away, but a distinctive tattoo, 3 dots in a triangular formation, gave an identificatory hook. That tattoo matched a record in a municipal database connected to an ex-convict who had been employed by a private security consultancy that had worked for a client with a stake in Longcheng's routes. The chain was circumstantial but strong in the way juries tend to like. Logs, footprints, a paid check, a string of emails back and forth. But courtroom outcomes are not the only things that change hearts. The hospital room where the infant slept and Su Rong recovered became a place of confession. Lu Zhang stayed at her bedside the whole night. He spoke in small truths, not because the cameras could see him, but because someone who has been wronged in private cannot be corrected by public statement alone. He told her, haltingly, about his father's pressure, about the way inheritance had hardened his decisions into armor. He did not ask forgiveness as a bargain. He offered it as an admission. He said, "I should have fought with you, not against you." She listened. She is not unforgiving by nature, and she knows the difference between contrition and convenience. She watched him like a scientist watches a reaction. The way his voice softened when he spoke of the baby, the way his hands now trembled around a swaddled stranger who bore family resemblance. There was sorrow in his posture and a weight of accountability. There was also a truth she had learned the hard way. Some apologies are doors to be opened, others are mirrors that reflect only the one who needs to change. At a hospital corridor press briefing later that morning, Lu Zhang did something for which no PR team had fully prepared him. He stood before the cameras, not behind the protective shield of a corporate podium, and he spoke in a voice that sounded worn and achingly real. He publicly apologized for the family's role in the smear, for the pressure that had driven paperwork into people's lives, for anything that had made Su Rong feel diminished.
He spoke of duty and of a desire to do right by the child. At the end of his remarks, in a move both dramatic and intimate, he reached into his jacket and took out a small velvet box. For a beat, the room dissolved into the kind of breathless speculation usually reserved for soap operas. He said, very simply, "Su Rong, if there is any path back for us, I would rather take it with honesty than with control." The box opened to reveal a ring. It was an old ring, faded, worn, a symbol heavy with history. What Lu Zhang had intended as a public act of contrition became the pivot the title would later call both dramatic and decisive. The cameras framed him like a man offering recompense. The world expected a theatrical reconciliation, a headline-grabbing acceptance, a return to the old script where women are folded back into the narratives of men. Instead, the camera angle captured a woman in a hospital bed, pale but steady, whose eyes carried a finite, precise light. She watched him with all the attention of someone who had assessed variables and chosen a response not for the cameras, but for the life she intended to raise. It would have been easy, in the way that history sometimes is, for Su Rong to accept a ring as the shortest route to safety. After the months of exhaustion, after the abduction, after the child's first cry, a ring might have seemed like a bridge quickly formed. But Su Rong's decisions are measured not by convenience, but by consequence. She reached for the ring, felt its weight, and sat up. The room hushed. Her voice was clear and steady as she spoke, not to perform, but to state a boundary. "Lu Zhang," she said, "what you offer is a promise. I have been offered many promises, some polite, some transactional. This is not a moment for a golden era reconciliation. This is a moment to decide who will raise this child and how. I will not return to a life that sells me as protection." There was a startled ripple among the reporters and staff. Even Lu Zhang's face, which had been taut with hope, altered into something more complicated. The old comfort of power was breaking into the humility of real loss. He had expected drama to steer the narrative. He had not expected the woman he loved to choose differently. Harsh as it may sound, the public needed closure. Su Rong refused to supply a neat one for them. Instead, she provided clarity. "I want to raise my child in honesty," she said. "I want a partner who offers agency, not ownership. If you are willing to change, really change, then show it in the way you move forward, not in a ring meant for optics." It was not a flat refusal. It was an invitation to accountability. It did not demand that Lu Zhang leave his life. It asked that he reconstruct his obligations in a way that respected her autonomy. For some, it would be unsatisfying. For Su Rong, it was the only honest path. The moment gave Ao Shiwan room to act in a way that mirrored the title's promise. The investor had paid for sabotage, to force a scandal, to drive down Longcheng's market value, and to install a more pliable executive. Zhang had subcontracted the hack, and the hacker had been sloppy when he used a relay that linked back to an address with CCTV evidence showing a courier who matched the hired men who had taken Su Rong. The police had the tape. They also had a witness, an intern coerced into copying files, whose testimony was solid once immunity was offered. Consequence followed consequence in a sequence that matched legal procedure and public drama. The hacker was jailed, Zhang's firm faced charges for conspiracy, and the investor's role appeared in regulatory filings that made clear the effort to manipulate the airline's stock market standing. The board member tendered his resignation under pressure. Lin Zhenzhen, who had amplified rumors and may have allowed her jealousy to harden into complicity, was called to provide testimony. She admitted to passing along suspiciously edited footage she had believed authentic. She was reprimanded and placed on leave pending a full inquiry.
Her resignation followed after the inquiry found that her actions, while not criminal, had been ethically compromised in ways the industry could not tolerate. The law, when given the right evidence, does not move with theatrical swiftness, but it does move. The Internal Affairs Unit issued a press release that highlighted the chain of custody for the hacked packets, the plausibility of motive, and the steps taken to prosecute. In the court of public sentiment, evidence that fit practice finally reframed speculation into narrative that bore weight. The protective myth of wealth could no longer hide beneath the veneer of presumed innocence. Public vindication included more than arrests. It included an offer. Longchang Airlines proposed a public safety audit to be led by an independent party with Su Rong as a key consultant. It was an awkward olive branch, made real by her conditions. The audit would be governed by transparent criteria, she would lead an independent team, and the company would fund a foundation to oversee the implementation of her safety protocols across regional carriers. The offer was a concession that recognized talent and acknowledged past harm. Su Rong considered it as she had considered all offers, not as a trophy, but as a tool for structural change. Lu Zheng, for his part, faced a schism of consequence in both public and private spheres. The board had to answer for the cracks in oversight. He had to reckon with the role his family had played in making a marriage into a corporate lever. He did not escape everything. Public opinion demanded accountability alongside the legal processes.
But the work he had done after the abduction, sitting at a hospital bed, turning off cameras, listening, began to transform him in a way that had nothing to do with reputational salvage and everything to do with a man learning how to be fearless in a different way, fearless enough to change his habits. Months later, the scandal that had once poised to unmake Su Rong became the vector through which she remade the field. Her safety system was tested again in a controlled environment and then implemented across regions. The independent foundation, funded by Wu Shiyuan's channels and by a corporate settlement, created an endowment for independent aviation research led by women in engineering. It was not a victory lap, it was structural repair. In quieter ways, life rearranged itself around the choices she had made. Su Rong accepted Wu Shiyuan's partnership, and they began a life that balanced public work and private tenderness without turning their private life into a commodity. He did propose formally months later, not in front of press flurries, but in a small garden by the same hospital where their child had been born. He knelt on a patch of damp grass and offered a ring that matched the quiet promise they had already made: presence, partnership, equality. She accepted because she wanted it and because she had chosen it herself. Lu Zheng watched them at a discreet distance. He had not been here to be the man who stole back what belonged to him. Instead, he had turned his energies to corporate reform and to a kind of private penance, work that did not require public approval because the only audience he needed to repair something for was his own conscience. He did not stand in their way as a specter of past mistakes. There were moments of awkwardness and regret between him and Su Rong, and there were other moments when their shared history allowed for a small kindness, an exchange of school supplies for the child, a short conversation about whether the infant needed a winter coat or a different formula. They had both learned what it meant to surrender ownership in the name of care. Not everyone forgave him. That was not the point. Responsibility, rather than absolution, was what he had bought himself with his change. The Lu family's legacy had to be rebuilt internally and publicly in ways that acknowledged culpability without dissolving the company into infighting. They navigated that path with varying degrees of success. As for Lin Zhenzhen, the arc of her story bent toward the professional reckoning that often accompanies public missteps. She faced censure and took time away. In that space, she reflected not only on ambition, but on the cost of allowing professional rivalry to harden into vindictiveness. She returned to aviation with a new focus, part contrition and part a renewed commitment to systems over spectacle. Her rivalry with Su Rong softened into a wary professional respect that would, in years to come, produce better protocols because their friction had been turned toward improvement rather than destruction. Public discourse, always hungry for tidy endings, argued about the righteousness of Su Rong's choices for months. Some insisted she should have accepted Lu Zhang's proposal and become a visible emblem of restored family unity. Others celebrated her refusal to be repurchased and hailed her acceptance of Ocean as a model of partnership uncoerced. Su Rong herself refused to engage in the performative debates. She and Ocean raised their child in a modest house where the wallpaper had been chosen by the woman who had once hidden code on a battered laptop. She returned to the lab and to the cockpit and to the boardroom in a rhythm that belonged to her. She traveled sometimes for audits, sometimes for lectures. The world recognized her finally in a way that valued her contributions. The twist the title promised, a CEO's divorce proposal leading to a surprising new love, had unfolded not as a melodramatic replacement of one ownership with another, but as a pivot toward autonomy and a love built on reciprocity. Lu Zhang's public proposal had been the catalyst for a choice she had already been constructing in private, a refusal to be defined by other people's narratives and a willingness to accept a future built in collaboration rather than in control. In a small ceremony a year after the birth, Ocean and Su Rong exchanged vows, not before a crowd, but in the presence of a handful of friends, engineers who had become family, a neutral auditor, and Lu Zhang, who came because he wanted to witness, in his own way, that the woman he had once tried to confine had chosen a life that was whole and free. He did not stand in the way. He offered a quiet blessing. It was not redemption in the cinematic sense, but a human concession. He had learned to let go. If there is a final image to hold, it is not the ring or the boardroom podium. It is Su Rong in a modest kitchen, hands sodden with dishwater, laughing a laugh that contains both the tiredness of a woman who has fought and the lightness of a woman who has chosen. Ocean stands opposite her, fetching a towel, his smile the kind that does not need spectacle. The child, now toddling and fiercely curious, reaches for a small model plane Su Rong keeps on the windowsill, the symbol of a life that once tried to tie her down, now becoming the emblem of a future she is building. There are consequences that remain, a board that still learns to be accountable, a family that still has fractures, a city that still loves to gossip. But there is also a system improved, a woman vindicated in both public and private terms, and a new love offered and accepted on mutual ground. The CEO's dramatic bid to reclaim a life by proposing in public became, in the end, the very moment that forced Su Rong to choose for herself, and she chose a path that honored the child, her career, and a love that asked nothing from her but her consent. Like and comment. Did she make the right choice, reunite, or start over?